My name is Nolan Jouer, and welcome to my project. This is a series of interviews and this short introductory video which aim to answer the all too commonly asked question, what is classical guitar? Well, what is classical guitar? As the name implies, it's classical music played on guitar. The end. Just kidding. But really it's about that simple. Just like classical violin, cello, piano, it's classically composed music that happens to be played on guitar. In the various interviews that I do, we talk about how it's defined and, different areas of the world about classical guitar. But I kind of define it in three major areas. It's the music we play, the instrument that we play it on, and the technique we use. And those three are what I'm going to be briefly covering in this video. Before I get started, I just want to mention that in the descriptions of all the videos, there should be timestamps with headers. And so feel free to just jump around and click on whatever seems interesting. So just to jump right in, the music. We generally start from the Renaissance era and move through Baroque, classical, romantic, into contemporary. And even though the guitar didn't exist in the Renaissance era as we know it today, it definitely evolved throughout the ages into what we know. And I talk a lot about that in my interview with Brian Head, so be sure to check that one out. But in the Renaissance, it was mostly lute music that was arranged. Same with Baroque. I'd like to briefly sight read some excerpts just to kind of give you a sense of what these different eras sound like on guitar. Starting with Renaissance. Baroque. Classical. Romantic. Some contemporary. Now, that very reductive, of course, but they kind of have that feeling to them. And once we get into the contemporary era, there's a lot of music that we play on guitar that might not, technically be called classical music, but we still claim it as classical guitar. One of my favorite examples of that is an arrangement by Roland Dyens of A Felicidade by Antonius Carlos Jobim. So, if it's not classical music, why do we still claim it as classical guitar? Well, that's where the instrument and the technique kind of come into play. The instrument as we know it, the guitar, again, evolved kind of from the lute. Even the electric guitar evolved from that history of plucked instruments. Brian Head, again, goes into far more depth about that in our interviews, so certainly check that out. But I just want to quickly go over the differences between a classical guitar and an electric and acoustic, steel string acoustic guitar. So essentially, the electric guitar, as we know it, at least some of them are solid wood bodies with thinner necks that are kind of long. They sometimes have a cutaway, very often, and most notably about electrics is that they use electricity, in that they have electronics built into them, and they use external electronics to amplify and change their sound. They, like the steel string acoustic, use metal strings, and using that as a transition, steel string acoustic is very similar to the classical guitar, a little bit different. Usually they, like the electric, have a thinner neck, this part. Their bodies sometimes aren't quite as big. They're made of different woods, and the construction and the bracing inside is a little bit different. Also, their pegs shoot outward instead of backwards. Like electric guitars, steel string acoustic guitars usually have little balls on the bottom of their strings that anchor them, whereas classical guitars, I'm not sure if it can come across in the video, are tied with knots on the bridge. The biggest differences about classical are that the neck is wider, it's a little bit thicker, that allows for maneuverability in the left hand. Our strings are nylon, a type of plastic, which are both wider in diameter and have a little bit of a warmer, softer tone. Actually, these strings are kind of why a lot of beginner guitarists start on these, because they're a little bit easier on the fingertips than the really thin metal strings. Other than that, we also usually don't have cutaways. As I said, with electric guitars, a lot of times they do. Sometimes on acoustic guitars they do, because a lot of times they're playing up above the 12th fret. And on classical guitars, the 12th fret meets the body right about there. On electric guitars, sometimes the body meets it much farther up the neck because they need more maneuverability up there. These instrumental differences for the classical guitar lend itself to the technique, and that's what I'd like to talk a little bit about now, without going really into detail about technique and trying to make it a lesson. But as you probably noticed from my playing, classical guitarists are finger style. We use our fingers to pick the strings and don't use a pick. This is because, aside from some advanced picking techniques, I'm sure that there are, when you use a pick, you can either pluck one string or you can strum. But it's very hard with a pick to play two strings on opposite sides of the neck at the same time. And because of the music that we play, we have a lot of polyphony going on, with bass lines, melodies, inner voices all happening at the same time. And using our fingers as picks allows us to bring out those different lines and give them their own independent directions. Now, this is very similar to fingerstyle guitar, which is very commonly played on steel string acoustics. But the main difference there is that we grow our fingernails out. So if you ever see a guitarist with really long fingernails, you might think, wow, that person has poor hygiene. But actually, they might just be a classical guitarist. I don't know how well it comes across in the video, but our thumbnails are usually especially pretty long for the bass notes. But we grow our nails out, and probably the biggest difference about classical technique as opposed to other guitar technique, like fingerstyle or rock and jazz, is that we really focus on the right hand and the approach to the string and the movement of the fingers. This is because, as somebody once said, classical guitar really, and we talked a lot about this in my interview with Scott Tennant, really excels at tone production and changing the tone. Not that it can't be done on piano, but it's a lot harder on piano to get really different timbres. And somebody once said that guitar is second only to voice in the variance of timbres that it can produce and tones. Just for a quick example, we can change the flexibility of our joints to make the sound a little warmer. Might not come through the mic very well. We can change where we play in relation to the fretboard or near the bridge. Go over the fretboard, it's a little softer. Gets a little thinner towards the bridge. We can also change the angle, the arching of our wrist and the angle of our wrist. Which changes kind of the roundness of the sound. There are all sorts of techniques that we learn to change the sound that we get, which adds a lot of variety into the music. Other really notable technique things, not to just focus on the right hand, I'm sure you've noticed my guitar is held at an angle. Usually classical guitarists do this either through the use of a guitar support or more traditionally a footstool. With the footstool, as you know, players like Andrei Segovia and a lot of the more old school kind of players, they will have their left leg elevated and guitar propped up on it like such. Nowadays, people use guitar supports pretty commonly. I, for one, use one that sticks on with magnets. There are also those which use suction cups, and they even have nice little pillows which you can rest your guitar on, which is very comfortable. But the guitar is held at an angle, and this is to facilitate the left hand to move and shift very easily, and have a certain position that's somewhat unique to classical guitar. But the right hand is really where a lot of the differences and show themselves, and where classical really tends to excel. Aside from the nails, nail shape is also really important for guitarists, but not quite enough time to dive into that. But that's mainly the big differences between classical guitar and other types of guitar. The music that we play, the instrument itself is very different. Well, somewhat different. And the technique that we use differs from other styles of guitar. This is pretty much it for my intro, but in all of the different interviews, we talk a lot more about these points. We talk about life in the classical guitar world, different professions, history of guitar, tone production, all kinds of things. So again, there will be timestamps down below, so feel free to check those out and kind of just jump around in the videos and see what is interesting to you. Thanks so much for watching.